Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real pleasure of mine to have Rick Anderson back on the show. He is one of the smartest gentlemen from a political standpoint that I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the course of the last couple of decades, actually, in Canada. He's a long-time political activist. He's very active in the energy transition area today. He runs a consulting firm that's called, what was it, Fourth Force?
E4 strategy.
E4 strategy that we're going to talk about in regards to sustainable alternative energy. He says that spent most of his time last year going to conferences and speaking and trying to convince people to do things. And he's a prolific reader and poster of interesting topics. And so I thought it'd be great to do a complete roundup with Rick about what's going on in the world. One of the things that he's spoken about just recently is the energy transition. I want to talk about that, where he actually started, really suggesting to people that more was happening than some people were thinking on a post that I read with interest on LinkedIn. But then also we talked just before the show started about another post that he had that talked about the greatest risk in 2024 is the United States in war with itself. Fascinating conversation. So, Rick Anderson, welcome to the show, sir.
Morning, Brian. It's great to see you again. Good evening, Brian. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you, sir. So let's talk with energy transition and this fascinating post where you were, I think, suggesting to someone else on LinkedIn that a lot more is happening than they were giving credit for. Is that your position, that actually we're making progress?
It is. We are making progress. The changes that are going on and have been going on now for really half a century are more profound than people recognize. I mean, we in our somewhat cynical politics, contemporary politics, we like to say we're not accomplishing anything. And we say that about a lot of things, including the energy transition. And it's just not true in most of those fields. And it's especially not true with respect to the energy transition. There's lots going on.
You had a list of things that we need, which I thought was really quite interesting. Rational economic planning, policies that encourage all types of energy, including the best of nuclear, thought given to the expansion required for EV adoption from the perspective of our grid, our infrastructure, and general transmission of electricity, and consultation about real engineering issues. But you did disagree that Canada be described as proceeding with reckless panic. Why would people think that we're proceeding with reckless panic?
Well, this is a response. People can find this on LinkedIn if they want to, which is where I do most of my social media posting these days because it's so much saner an environment than some of the others that I won't mention. And this gentleman had said something and posted something in response to something else I posted that basically said all of the things you just listed. So I agreed with a great many of the things he said. We need rational economic planning. We need to make sure we're planning out the electricity grids properly so that they can sustain the amount of demand that we're shifting their way in the process of an energy transition. Of course, we need to do those things. So I agreed with him about all of that, but I disagreed with him politely that those things are not actually happening. I think they are happening. I mean, Ontario, we got the Ontario Independent System Operator who now operates who coordinates all the inputs of electricity into the Ontario electricity grid from many, many sources. It used to be basically just hydro, and then it became hydro and nuclear in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then now it's a hydro and nuclear and wind and solar, and there's many, many different producers of energy in Ontario. They're not all just crown corporations anymore. And they're all putting power into the grid in Ontario, and the Ontario and that organization that and of course they've got to balance that minute by minute, every day of the year, with demand, because you can't put more electricity into the grid than is being used, and you can't put less. If either one of those circumstances will result in our electricity grid becoming unstable and effectively shutting itself down. That's happened, of course. We remember that in Ontario 25 years ago, the big Pennsylvania circuit breaker thing that basically spilled right across the Northeast and turned off the power in most of Southern Ontario for, I can't remember how long it was, but it was the better part of a day. And that was just basically a failure of grid balancing. So OEC, the Ontario Independent System Operator, now has this task in Ontario of coordinating all of the minute-by-minute demand and the minute-by-minute supply, millions of users, hundreds of power generators all needing to meet each other in the electricity grid. And that, this gentleman said there isn't the rational planning going on. There isn't forecasting what the grid's going to need in the future and so on. And I disagreed with him because there actually is. To actually accomplish that balancing day by day takes enormous planning. If you don't plan that properly 3 or 4 years ago, you're not going to meet the demand today. If you don't plan it 3 or 4 years from now, and really ultimately 20 years from now, you won't meet that demand tomorrow. And this gentleman was concerned that we're not doing what we need to do to meet that balance, to meet that overall demand, and to balance it on a minute by minute basis. And I don't think that's true. And I think it's important that people understand that even though we say, often say Canada's broke, the healthcare system, the list, and we do have problems in our healthcare system. We do have problems in our immigration system. We do have problems with the imbalance of housing demand. We do have problems with inflation. We do have problems, working out the dynamics and the politics and so on of the energy transition. But we are also pretty good at solving those problems, and we should stop being so negative about it. We should actually understand better how well we're doing in some of these areas.
That was quite the list of problems that you just quickly ran through, and we may have to come back to some of those to address them if you actually think we're making progress on them. But on the energy transition, the comment that I hear over and over again, we heard it from some of the Republican debates down in the United States, is that these mandates for electric vehicles in the future are going to overwhelm the grid, and we're not coming close to thinking about building enough generating capacity to provide enough electricity to just recharge all these cars. And with the time frame it takes to build a nuclear power plant or any other kind of electrical engineering generating station, how can we possibly transition to electric cars?
I think that's such a great question, Brian. And a lot of people do ask it. And as you referred to it, it came up in that presidential primary debate the other night. Politics frustrates me a lot. I've got 30, 40, 50 years since I worked on my first campaign. And I've become so, in a sense, disillusioned with politics, that people say things like that. People in responsible positions, like 2 presidential candidates, both of whom are well experienced, that they would say things like that, because it's just actually not true. I don't mean that they're lying. I mean that they're poorly informed, and then they take their kind of shallow base of information and they turn it into a slogan or a statement or a spin line like that. And it concerns people, and it drives public concern and anxiety and so on. So North America is not the leader in the energy transition. The leader is Europe. They started it 40 years before we did. We started our energy transition, in one sector, in oil, 50 years ago, at the same time as Europe, and come back to what happened in the 1970s that started to drive a transition away from oil. But that's when the oil transition actually started, 1973. But broadly speaking, there's been an energy transition going on towards lower emission energy use in Europe since the 1980s. Not just oil, but more broadly, coal and so on. And in North America, it started about 20 years ago. So we have had a transition going on. You can see it in all the data. We've shifted massively away from coal, starting in Ontario in North America, but now it's happening right across North America. And we've shifted away from oil. We're shifting slightly away from gas, and we're growing all the low emission supplies of electricity. And you can look at all the kind of data about that. With respect to your question, and the question that came up in that presidential debate about electric vehicles, the problem with not being a leader is you think you're the first person. In our politics, we keep thinking America or Canada is the leader in healthcare or whatever. And we think we're doing the same thing with respect to electric vehicles, but we're not. I mean, Norway's got 10 times the market share of new sales of electric vehicles that Canada has, that Ontario has. 8% market share in Ontario, 80% in Norway. So
Seriously,
if you want
Norway, 80% of car sales are electric.
New car sales, 80% Norway. Electric, that's right. And they've been doing that now for 10 years. I mean, not 80% for 10 years, but they've been up there. So if anybody wants to know what happens to an electricity grid when you dump 80% of new sales of electricity vehicles onto a grid in a cold country that's got its own long distances and everything else, not like Canada's long distances. Nobody except Russia has our long distances. But if you dump that many electric cars onto an electricity grid, what happens? Well, go call the president, the CEO of Norsk Hydro. He'll tell you, or she'll tell you. It doesn't have that big an impact. First of all, because these cars don't use that much power. So that's problem one that people have. Problem two is that most of the charging is not done in your neighborhood 401 electric fueling plaza, which now has all kind, has now, most of them now have both gas and electric charging outlets there. That's not where most charging occurs. That's where charging occurs if you're on a family trip or something. But the most charging, 80% of charging, happens at home. And guess when it happens? It happens at the evening. It happens overnight. And guess what's important to understand about the electricity grid? That's its quietest time. We have all kinds of extra capacity that goes down, goes offline because of the balancing thing that I mentioned with respect to the electricity during the evening. After about 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, the demand for electricity tails off in almost every jurisdiction you can look at, including Ontario, including Canada. And that means that we're now plugging these cars in most of the time at a time when we've got excess electricity, not a shortage. And people don't understand that. But presidential candidates who are talking about this thing and claiming certain things, they should actually get themselves better informed about this. But that's politics.
That's politics. Great line. We're going to have to take a break with Rick Anderson and come back in just 2 minutes and talk a little bit more. Maybe we'll turn to the risks in 2024 that we talked about on the top of the show. Stay with us, everyone. Back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Rick Anderson, who is probably one of the smartest political individuals I've ever come across in Canadian politics. I had the pleasure of interacting with him. Gosh, Rick, when was it? It was like 3 or 4 decades ago that we were arguing back and forth on political ideas when we were both young liberals at the time. Quite a history that you've had in politics and different political consulting, different campaigns. I think that the book that you're going to write about your history in politics is going to be a fascinating read whenever you sit down and get a chance to do it. E4 that you're currently focused on is interesting because you're talking about, what is it, a transition from wood to coal to gas to sustainable? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's basically right. A transition, like, it's been tens of thousands of years since humans first figured out how to control fire, more or less control fire, and use it for heating and cooking and so on. That's what we had: wood and peat, carbon-based products, both of them, for the longest time, like for tens of thousands of years, literally. That's what we had until we discovered how to use coal. Discovered the steam engine, basically. And then that led us to start using a lot of coal. And that was the early 1800s. And that's what powered the Industrial Revolution in Europe and in North America. Trains all became possible, steam engines. And ships went from wind power to coal. And the time across the Atlantic went from 8 days to 4 days. That was a huge revolution. It enabled all kinds of trade and commerce and industry to develop. That was the story of the 1800s. And around 1900, petroleum, crude oil, came onto the picture, and it almost immediately started to replace coal because it was so much more convenient to use. Coal, you got to dig it out of the ground. It's a dirty, dangerous job. You've got to ship it someplace, another dirty, dangerous job. What's in your imagination about what those tenders on steamships were in the days when people were shoveling coal 24 hours a day into those big engines on steamships. And along comes petroleum. You just put a pipe, put a hose into a tank and fill it up, and off you go. And there's no labor involved after that in fueling the engines. And that's true on locomotives, and it's true on ships, and it's true in people's homes. I know when I grew up, our first house had a coal bin in the basement and a coal furnace. And, I had to get up twice in the night. I was only 5 or 6 years old at the time, but, parents had to get up twice in the night and shovel coal into that beast down there. And it was all dirty. The kids liked to go and play in the coal bin and come out with, coal face. But, that was the early 1960s. By the 70s, really almost nobody was using coal for home heating anymore. That's how fast the coal to petroleum transitioned. We peaked in terms of using oil and globally about 1905. Sorry, we peaked in terms of using coal in about 1905. At that point in time, coal was providing something like 55% of all the energy use around the world. And today it's still about 28, 29%. So it's still there. It's going down fast. I mean, it's only 17% of the American electricity grid, the lowest it's been in half a century now. So coal is on a long, long, long 100-year decline as the world's major share of energy. There's still too much of it, and it's basically the dirtiest energy form that humans routinely use. China's using way too much of it. India's using way too much of it. Canada's completely phasing out right now. So we're on this long decline that we have been going on for 100 years, over 100 years with coal, but it's still over a quarter of global energy. And it's going to be probably 10 years from now, about 10%. So it doesn't go away. I mean, they call this in energy transition speak additive. Transitions are not replacements. They are replacements, but they're not completely replacements. They're additives. We still burn wood. We still use coal. We still will be using petroleum in the future, even though some people wish that was not going to be true. But we mostly are shifting towards what you call sustainables, low emission sources of energy that don't add pollution to our atmosphere. And that's where the growth all is right now. And Ontario's got a fabulously big array. I mentioned that the peak of oil, people talk about the peak oil demand, and by that they're talking about how many millions of barrels a day the world uses, and it's about 100 million barrels a day globally. And it goes up by 1 or 2 million barrels a day per year. So it goes from 100 million barrels a day to 101, 102. And this is the nature of growth in oil demand. And people still say, well, we're using more and more oil. And by that measure, that's still true. I think that's going to tail off. Most people do. But there's another measure, and it's what percentage of the planet's entire energy demand is addressed by oil. And I mentioned earlier that stopped in 1970. That peaked in 1973. Can you guess why that happened in 1973?
Oil embargo from OPEC.
You got it. The biggest producers in the world used the commodity of oil as a weapon against their customers, Western countries. And at that point in time, we had a response that was driven not by lower emission or anything else, but by national security considerations. And it happened in Washington, it happened in Ottawa, it happened in Brussels, it happened in all the Western capitals. Everybody said, we need to find ways to use less oil. And what oil we do use, we need to find ways to produce it closer to home and not be dependent on somebody who's an unreliable supplier. Those two things happened, and they still drive energy policy in North America and Europe, and they have for 50 years now. So the result of that is that in 1973, global energy demand was 51% addressed by oil. Oil supplied just about half of all of the world's energy needs. And today, it's in the high 20s. People don't know that's happening. People don't think that's happening. The oil industry will tell you it's still growing. Well, it is by a tiny amount. Meanwhile, the energy demand is growing faster than the oil demand. So the percentage of oil.
So that's fascinating. So you're saying coal is around 20%, oil is in the high 20s. So that adds up to 50%. So you're saying more than 50% is already more low emission?
Not quite. You're close, but there's a third piece of the puzzle that are all in the 20s, the 25 to 30% each. And that's coal, oil, and natural gas. And then there's the rest of global energy demand, and that's hydropower, nuclear, growing wind and solar, biofuels, all kinds of things are going on the low emission side of energy production and use. But the three fossil fuels are still basically amongst them, addressing about 75, close to 80% of global energy demand. Now, that's really what we're trying to solve with the energy transition globally. And the first and most important part of that is getting rid of the rest of coal. Coal provides, as I said, about 28%, 29% of global energy. But that results in 44% of GHG emissions from energy. So basically, it's like 1.5 times more polluting than the other fossil fuels. Oil is going to, I think, hang around for a while, but increasing for a long time. But increasingly, it's going to be used for non-combustion purposes: lubricants, chemicals, synthetics, nylon, fibers, carbon fiber. Oil is used for all kinds of things. In the United States, 13% of oil is not burned, which means it's not really emitting in the same way as when you put it in a vehicle or a furnace or something like that and just pumps GHGs into the atmosphere. It's a much more passive, and most of the time, higher value use of oil. So I think oil is going to continue to be a thing, still for combustion, but less and less for combustion, because that's where the pollution occurs. And the combustion that it will be used for will be abated by carbon capture and tools like that. Gas, to me, is the thing that's not going away anytime soon. And because of the thing we were talking about before the break, the need for electricity grids to balance themselves minute by minute, or they become unstable and can go, out of business, can fail. That gas is one of the best contributors to that exercise. People talk about baseload power. Hydro is baseload power. You can count on it, working day after day after day, although it too is seasonal. We talk about nuclear reactors. They have nuclear reactors have an uptime of over 90%. One of the most productive forms of energy we've got, and it's basically low emission in terms of GHGs. Those two things people think of as baseload power. We still think of coal as baseload power, but we're getting rid of it. And gas is the other kind of baseload power, and it's the most responsive. A gas plant can actually move up and down in terms of its production minute by minute as the grid needs that. So it's a tremendous stabilizing force as you bring more wind and solar into the electricity grids. Gas is one of your best tools for complementing the demand, the balancing between demand and supply, because you never know. We don't know 1 hour from now what the wind and solar contribution to the Ontario grid is. We do know 1 hour from now what the nuclear contribution is going to be. We do know 1 hour from now what the hydro contribution is going to be. We don't know what the wind and solar will be. They're important. They're important pieces of the puzzle, and they become a lot cheaper than people understand. You remember how controversial all of that was in Ontario when we started introducing those. And there was mandated feed-in tariffs. The prices that Ontario Hydro was paying for wind and solar were like 50 cents a kilowatt hour, 60 cents a kilowatt hour, completely unsustainable prices, because we turn around and sell that to consumers at 8 cents or 10 cents. So, it was a humongous subsidy. There was a humongous subsidy involved in it, but it got wind and solar out of the starting gate in Ontario. And today, that grid operator I was talking about can buy wind and solar power supply in Ontario for 5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour, not 6
It's
years
gone
ago.
from 50 cents to 5 cents in how long? 10 years?
15. Yeah, 20.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, but it is true. Now, the thing is, you can't count. People say, well, we're just going to run all of our grid that way. The problem is you can't count on that supply 24/7, 365. So, and oftentimes in the auctions, electricity is bought and sold now between generators and distributors in basically dynamic auctions constantly, the same way Google sells advertising. It's very dynamic. The prices change. You'd sell long-term contracts, you'd sell short-term contracts, you can have standby contracts, all kinds of different forms of commerce now in electricity markets in Ontario and across North America, around the world. But wind and solar are taking a bigger and bigger piece of it. I think in Canada, wind is probably the more important element than solar is, but that's a kind of a personal view, but it's backed up by the data right now. But, forecasts are for, what was it? Polls are for donkeys. that was Diefenbaker, I think, said that. Some forecasts are a little bit like that too. Um, but Canada's got one of the world's best wind resources. By the way, people measure this. We have three coasts. The best place to trap wind, capture wind, and turn it into power is offshore. We haven't really started to tap into that in Canada because we got so much of it, so much energy onshore that we don't need to, go off 5 or 10 miles offshore and put platforms down into the sea bottom and everything else, which is what they're doing all over Europe now and parts of Asia. That wind resource out there just off the coast and on the Great Lakes is an enormously important resource to the future. Anyway, yes, we've had in 20 years renewables, wind and solar renewables, go from 50, 60 cents startup kind of artificially high tariffs to a nickel. Now, an hour from now, the utility might be paying 7 cents for that very same power, or 4 cents. I mean, that's what the auctions are doing. So the suppliers of this don't actually know, A, how much supply they're going to produce, and B, what they're going to get in those dynamic auctions. But they do have some long-term contracts as well. So those ones tend to be a little higher than the spot auctions, 7 or 8 or 9 cents. But the utilities now have a buffet in front of them, and they can buy power from lots of different sources. And the big technology race that's going on in this space is about storage, electricity storage, especially a form of storage called long duration storage, meaning a couple of weeks, not a few hours. And once we figure out, and we will, there's a company in Toronto that's really doing some very interesting things about this. We could talk about it if you want. Once we figure out, in fact, there's several companies in Ontario and Canada that are leading the way in terms of R&D and in terms of storage. Once we figure out how to store electric power for days or weeks, we will be able to take all of that wind and solar power. Sometimes it's wasted, right? If the grid doesn't need more power, they can't use that power. They just have to curtail it. They have to stop producing it, or they have just let the wind turbine spin, but not sell it into the grid, which is basically wasting energy. Once we figure out how to make storage of electricity work for a longer duration, that wasted energy will be able to be stored and then used when it's needed. And that's one of the holy grail R&D things that's going on in the electricity world.
Is that just batteries?
Well, batteries are not able to do it yet. So batteries are one of the things where the R&D, batteries have been the first thing that we've kind of spent a lot of money on around the world, trying to find ways to make batteries store electricity for a longer duration than they do now. And there's a lot of ongoing development there. The lithium ion battery, the one that does everything from power your smartphone to your electric toothbrush to parts of the electricity grid and most electric vehicles. Its best days are probably behind it. It charges too slowly. The power, if you just leave it parked, it doesn't actually remain there. It dissipates. It's a tiny bit unstable. I don't want to scare people, but there's a reason they tell you if you drop your iPhone behind the seat of your aircraft, not to go looking for it yourself. The battery world is looking for the next generation of battery technology, and somewhere in there, they're going to find the answer to long duration electricity storage. They haven't really got it yet. Hydrostore, that company I mentioned in Toronto, they store energy by compressed air. In other words, they take electricity and they what do? They turn it into steam, they pump it into the ground, and they store it and they compress it. And then when they want to use it again, they've got a bunch of compressed air down there in big underground caverns, and they force them up through pipes that get skinnier as they go up. And the skinniness, the compression of the air coming up, the compressed air coming up, causes heat that you then turn into electricity. You can turn electricity into heat, turn heat into electricity. That's a pretty interesting idea, and they've got a contract now for $1 billion with a group of California electric utilities, a bunch of a particular region in California. I think it's a couple of dozen utilities, and they're installing a system like that. The other form of storage that's also being well, it's actually being employed quite a bit now by hydro utilities is what they call pumped storage, and that's how basic hydro dams works. We've got them all over Ontario. Got a reservoir of water. Water comes down the chute at great speed, having a big drop and lots of pressure behind it. It drives the turbines that produce electricity, and off it goes down the river. Well, instead, you capture it again, put it in a reservoir at the bottom, and at night, when electricity demand is low, you use electricity to pump it back up into the reservoir and use it again. And then you repeat the same thing tomorrow and the next day. So you're using the same reservoir of water, the same water, over and over and over again. It's producing electricity all day long when demand is high. That's basically how the demand works. It's high during the daytime, low at night. And you use cheap power or available power, surplus power during the night to pump it back up into the reservoirs. And we've got Manitoba Hydro produces electricity for North Dakota all day long with all the hydro they've got in Manitoba. It's one of the most hydro-rich provinces in the country. They produce and sell power into North Dakota all day long at good daily rates, and then they buy it back from North Dakota at night and use it to pump the same water, back up into the reservoir, and then they sell it back to North Dakota again at the higher price the next day. And that kind of stuff is actually happening. That's the kind of innovation that's going on around electricity. So when you ask the question, how are all these electric vehicles and heat pumps, which actually are a bigger future demand on our electricity grids, how are the grids going to meet the demand? They're going to meet it with technologies about storage, by expansion of wind and solar, by expansion of nuclear, which is already underway now in Ontario again for the first time in 20 years, and some ongoing expansion of hydro. All of those things.
Fascinating. You give us some optimism in an area that a lot of people are very pessimistic about. We've got to take another break for some more messages, and we'll be back in just 2 minutes with Rick Anderson. Stay with us, everybody. Interesting conversation tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Rick Anderson is my guest tonight. He's a long-term political activist involved in a bunch of different political campaigns over the years. He's been a commentator in lots of media opportunities. He's very involved in the energy transition area right now. He runs a consulting company called E4, which is talking about the energy transition. He has been to a bunch of these COP conferences, and I've had the pleasure of interviewing him after he's attended them, and he's told me what's happening. But he's also prolific in looking at what's going on around the world. And he posted a really interesting article just a couple of days ago about a report that said that the biggest risks in 2024 were the three wars that are occurring, and one of the wars was actually the U.S. against itself. I was shocked by that. Rick, can you explain?
Well, I was shocked about it as well. The group that does this is called Eurasia Group. A fellow by the name of Ian Bremner founded it, I guess, probably about 15 or so years ago. I should probably know that, but I don't. A very articulate guy, very smart guy. And he's pulled together a group of other people who work with him, assessing developments around the world and, sussing out where things are going better and things are going worse. And they put out every year now a top risk report that forecasts the year ahead in terms of risks to basic stability, economic stability, geopolitical stability, conflict stability, and so on around the world. And they're very interesting. Eurasia Group, you can find them basically on the web. Most of their stuff, a lot of their stuff is free. They do consulting for companies and so on, but they also issue public reports that anybody can read. And there's a podcast that they did earlier this week that went through the risks that they see for 2024. And the top three risks that they identified to geopolitical stability in the world in 2024 were what they called the three wars: Ukraine, Gaza, and the one they called the United States versus itself. And of those, they said the greatest threat to international stability in 2024 comes from the polarization, the political polarization in the United States, and the fact that America is kind of at war ideologically and politically with itself. And of course, that's personified by Donald Trump. Um, and that was a real stark kind of way of looking at it and putting it and expressing it. I don't think probably in the history of the world, maybe at the time of the Civil War, people saw the instability in the United States as the greatest threat to world stability. That's probably never been said, at least not since the Civil War. And at the time of the Civil War, it probably didn't matter that much to Europe. So I mean, it didn't have effects around the world. But the problems in American politics, which I think are quite severe, from top to bottom, they've been growing for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And now represent quite a significant threat, and they're spreading around the world. There are emulators spreading. I mean, there was a rally in Rome earlier this week where Mussolini was Hitler's ally during the Second World War. There was a rally with hundreds of young Italians standing in formation and doing the Heil Hitler salute. Um, you know, we don't like to think about where these things can lead, but we know that even in sophisticated, advanced places, Germany was a sophisticated country. Austria was a sophisticated country, well-educated, stable. Actually, Germany wasn't stable, and that was really one of the drivers there. It was very economically unstable after the First World War, and that's what gave Hitler his opportunity to kind of walk in and energize concern and disaffection and so on. But we haven't seen anything like that. We always overdo the Hitler analogies, and I'm not trying to do that because those were peculiar circumstances. But there are too many echoes of that right now, and people are being so careless. I mean, Donald Trump and most of the Republican Party thinks we should get out of the Ukraine war. That's Russia invading an independent democratic country on the threshold of Europe. He's also talking about some of those other countries, Lithuania and Latvia and so on, which he thinks of as traditionally and culturally part of the Russian Empire, which he is talking about rebuilding. People are not paying enough attention to that. And a leading candidate for the American presidency, Donald Trump, is acting like that's not our problem. And that's just not true. It is our problem around the world. If Russia's the biggest rogue state in the world right now. I don't think there's any question about that. Iran's probably a rogue wannabe state, certainly a failing state, and it's the one who's funding a lot of the problems in Gaza and funding these attacks by the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea, which are now bringing, British and American military forces, naval forces into contact with Iran-funded militants. We've got an unstable world out there, and the American role in maintaining that stability is quite important. And we've got a presidential candidate, a past president, maybe potential future president, who acts like it's not really America's job to do anything about that.
But it's not just Trump, and
No,
I do a lot of work in the United States, so I travel there quite frequently, and I'm aghast when I speak with really smart, capable, nice people that I'm doing work with that echo a lot of the same thoughts.
Yeah. So I also spent a fair bit of time there, and I like the States. But they've got many positive attributes, but they've got some real serious problems right now. They've never really resolved the profound race relations problems that the country has had. And if you look at a lot of things, healthcare, education, economic opportunities, poverty, et cetera, there's still a huge racial aspect of that. The poor are getting poorer in some American states, and they tend to be racial minorities. But now they've got this other problem, and so maybe we are starting to experience it too, And certainly Europe has, particularly Southern Europe, and that's migration that's essentially out of control. I mean, there are boats right now in the Mediterranean Sea of people illegally entering Europe from parts of North Africa, um, parts of the Middle East. They're often dislocated by conflict, where they live. But it's also quite often because of the huge economic balance of opportunities in Somalia and Ethiopia and so on versus here's Europe. And if you can get there, can you imagine how much better off your life and your kids and your health and your education or opportunities, blah, 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 your housing are going to be. And that's the same thing that's happening in South America versus North America. And, we're not paying very much attention to this, but that Rockham Road border crossing in Quebec, Vermont, that was a place where New York State was basically paying migrants who were coming across the America's southern border, paying the bus fare for migrants who were landing in New York City to carry right on going up to northern New York and northern Vermont and cross into Canada. And that border crossing is now going the other way. It's going south from Canada into the States. And why is that happening? It's because of this flood of, I'm not trying to stir up antagonism about immigration, but people need to understand what's actually happening here. The world flood of migrants, mostly dislocated by conflict, but perennially also dislocated by economic imbalances, are coming into Canada in various ways, and then they're moving into the States from here. And our border is, of course, far less protected than the American border is on the southern side. And so Americans are becoming concerned about that. They've always been more concerned, but concerned about that. We've always thought, well, they have no right to be, no real foundation to be. But that's less true today than it was. And of course, in our own country, we saw in 2022, and apparently has repeated itself in 2023, we had 1 million immigrants come to Canada in 2022. We've never had, I don't believe, a number that's bigger than about 400,000 or 450,000 or something like that. The government's goals are like less than 500,000. But somehow we ended up with 1 million people coming into Canada in 2022. And it looks like something like that has happened again in 2023. The numbers for the first 3 quarters sort of indicate that. Again, I think immigration, we've built Canada mostly through immigration over the years. I got no beef with immigrants. They have made and they do make a tremendous contribution to our country. But if they arrive in quicker numbers than we can handle, look at what's happening in our housing supply. Look what's happening with homelessness and so on. We need to actually make sure it's like the electricity grid. You need to balance the supply and demand. If this many people are being born or coming to the country, I mean, let's put out the welcome mat. But that welcome mat includes a place to live, not a gift as a place to live, but a place to live that they can, rent and buy.
How's this million coming in? Is it legal? Is it illegal? Is it pent up from past pandemic under immigration? Where's it coming from?
Most of ours, thankfully, is legal. I mean, one of the problems with illegal immigration is you don't know when it's happening. And now you can see it, of course, in the America's southern border. There's just a stream of people. And every day, I can't remember what the statistics are, but every month on the border patrols report what they call contact with thousands of immigrants that they turn them away or they arrest them or, and then they put them in a deportation process, which is broken in the United States. People are ordered to leave the country, but don't. And there's really almost no enforcement of that. There's very little enforcement. We don't really have that sort of problem in Canada. The growth in our immigration is particularly happening with foreign students who are a source of revenue to the country. They help bolster our education system. We got great universities in Canada, great trade schools, and people come from all over the world to go to them. In a sense, that's good business. Some of them stay afterwards. That's also good for us. We have shortages, as we know, for lots of trades. We have shortages, 5 million Canadians don't have GPs right now because we have a shortage of doctors. We have a shortage of nurse practitioners. We have shortages of labor in a lot of areas. And if more our population grows, the more we have demand for these kind of services. And unless there's a match of skills and demand, I mean, it's like the electricity grid, things start failing. And that's what's happening to us. So we have a lot of foreign students coming in. Apparently, some educational institutions are less um, diligent than others in making sure that the student not only has the academic qualifications and the funds to be able to register, apply for university, be accepted, and afford to be there, but that they've got actually a place to live. And what's happening is they're showing up for the first day of school and Labor Day and Labor Day of whatever year in Canada, and they don't have a place to stay. There's no residence for them on that campus. Some of the trade schools don't particularly have residences. Um, and the old thing where you could rent a room for somebody, there's a shortage of that too. And so we've got schools and universities, community colleges that are advertising their enrollment to foreign students need to take on some responsibility, and the governments need to make sure that they do, for making sure they've got a place to live. So students are a large part of it. We probably don't particularly want to discourage them, but we do need to make sure that we can handle them properly when they get here. And of course, they don't need just a place to stay. They need medical services and everything else too, like anybody else. Actually, students use less medical services than people your age and my age. So they're not a heavy demand on that piece of it, but they do have a range of services they need. And the more people are in the country, the more policing and so on, emergency services you need. So there are knock-on effects. There's also family reunification. And of course, Canada does, which means basically if you're here, you can apply to have your parents or your cousins or your relatives join you in the country. We support that, but it can be in some years a big number of people, and many of those are retired, so they're relatively heavy users of things like healthcare, and they also, of course, need housing, but they're not actually earning a living anymore and paying taxes. So there's a kind of economic imbalance there. Again, I'm not trying to stir up antagonism to
But
immigrants.
it certainly seems like an issue.
It is, and we've got to figure out. We got to figure out that when you apply to come to the country, that we've got a welcome mat we can put on. We're housing people in motels, like for long periods of time. It's costing taxpayers a lot of money, and it's a crummy existence for these people. It's better than a refugee camp in Jordan. There's no question about that, and that's where some people are coming from. So that's a step up for them, but that's not really, I don't think, what we intend to offer them as the Canadian dream.
Rick, we got to have you back to do another conversation about some of these other issues that you've talked about, housing, inflation, and Canadian politics. But this concern that you've identified about the U.S. at war with itself is really a huge issue. And the more time I spend in the United States, the more I enjoy the people that I meet, but the more concerned I get about how dysfunctional their politics is and how polarized their society is. There's just no question about it. But regrettably, we're out of time. So we're going to have to invite you back, and hopefully you'll accept my invitation to come back again, sir.
Be happy to, Brian. It's always great to talk to you, and I hope your audience appreciates this.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.